Hi, everyone. My name is Ben, and I am from Cleveland. I've been into The Secret for a year and a half or so. After having a targeted ad about an article that was written about it, and I bought it kind of sight unseen and brought it home to show my fiance, and she shared that she had been into it a few years ago and had a whole dossier on NOLA. So we've been kind of in and out of it, sort of passively researching and obviously watched EU and whatnot. Um, and I think easier said than done, but I think that generally speaking, though we've had some solved puzzles, that there's still something sort of overarching that we're missing about how these work. And I'm by no means saying that I have that something, but it's just kind of a concept that I'd sort of like to throw out there, if for no other reason than to get it out of my own brain. So I'm going to affectionately call this Smoosh Theory. So generally speaking, the gift giver post from this past year, I believe it was, pointing out that we should sort of categorize and think about what each painting has. So I know that's led a lot of people to making Excel sheets and stuff like that. And most have clocks or flowers or some kind of a humanoid figure, but the only thing that, to my knowledge, they all have is obviously whatever their individual jewel is. So focusing on that specific element, generally speaking, what I wanted to see was if you literally smush the book together. So except for New York City and San Fran, or the paintings thought to be associated with those, every other painting in the book faces another painting when you have the book closed. So what I really first did was just to take a Pilot G2, level 10, and just put a whole bunch of ink right on the jewel on one, and then close the book and see where that dot then sort of transferred over to the other side. Obviously, with one of the super duper El Cheapo modern versions of the book, not an earlier edition. But then you could sort of replicate that same effect using some kind of a tracing paper, or if you want to do the math on, it's this far from this left side and this far from the bottom, and then sort of figure it out that way. You could kind of replicate that same methodology in more than one different way. So starting with the ones that we have solved, if you take the where the jewel is on the page from Chicago, I believe it is, and smush it over to Cleveland, it does put you, kind of low left versus this wall from the Cultural Garden. And being from Cleveland, I've been here several times. I was happy to meet George and folks at the meetup. I was unable to be at the most recent one because we had to go to a wedding out of town. But it was my sister-in-law to be, Amber, that was at Viking Public House where some of y'all hung out. So this spot, this marker, if you look at the front side or the back side, the where the flower box is, or on the quote unquote top, that wall looks pretty similar from either side. So if they were super distinct from each other, and this gave us more clarity about the whole which side of the flower box were you supposed to be on at first thing, but because it looks pretty much the same from both sides, or pretty close to it, I don't know how helpful that is. If it looks more like the top side in the right-hand image here, then I would think that that would mean that it was buried sort of over the top of that wall to what would be the left coming from the top or the right coming from the bottom. And I've seen those videos and reenactments of Brian and Andy so many times, I don't even know which side they started on and which one they finished on. But I don't know if that would help clarify that in any way. It's just starting where we're starting because these are solved. Chicago, if you smush over, similar concept, but the dot would kind of put you off to the side of this fixture. So that verse, I think, was probably the most step-by-step of all of them, and then you end up, beyond those trees in this area, if somehow you line it up with this part of the fixture. So in retrospect, I know there's some debate about exactly where the spot was and this, that, and the other, but it is interesting that the jewel from the opposite page puts you close to that fixture, or at least I think so. but I don't know how much clarity that gives us. So, looking most recently at Boston, if the white sleeve on the bottom of that cuff would be home plate, your corresponding smoosh puts you out what would sort of be in front of it. So that would be super fun, again, if we knew exactly what spot it came from, because I think it's a lot more feasible to be away from home plate. Number one, I would like to assume that Byron wouldn't want people tearing up the structure of a home plate and possibly ruining a baseball field, because that's different than just sort of digging a random hole somewhere. And he seems to have been a pretty big baseball fan, so that's directly under home plate feels unlikely, but who knows at this point. The other thing is just looking at some of these older photos, that aerial was somewhere on Q for T. If at that time the baseball field in question was more like the middle image, where there was grass on the infield, then digging a hole where there was grass and therefore probably a little bit softer turf makes more sense. Not that I've ever tried to dig a hole on a baseball field in Manio, North Carolina. That would be irresponsible. But right on that sort of hard pan part of a baseball field, it's just very, very hard. And I can't even imagine how you would dig a 3-foot deep hole there without a pickaxe or heavy equipment. So again, if we somehow knew exactly where it was versus home plate, this might give us a little bit more credibility to this idea. But I just think it's interesting that it is so close to that home plate symbol. Now, when it comes to Milwaukee, then, the corresponding smoosh spot would put you down near where that yellow star is on the juggler. And I've always loved the shape to our top right over the left eye of the juggler so we from the rebus know that this is the Milwaukee painting. And then it's always looked to me a lot like the shape of the Milwaukee River up near Lincoln Park, kind of on the northern part of that river system. So tracing the outline of that river down, if that were to sort of follow the hairline from that sort of bunched up harp looking area back around to our left, that would put you further south than Lake Park. And I haven't looked a whole lot at Milwaukee, but it looks like that far south would be in Caesars Park, or there's a reservoir park down in that direction. And I haven't looked a whole lot at Milwaukee personally, just because it seems like a lot of people do. But that whole Japanese clue that might give you Drummond Street, which might mean that the Milwaukee verse, quote unquote, should put you up near Mount Royal and Montreal, has always kind of appealed to me, just if we are to believe the Japanese clues at their face value. So if the flip side, then the other verse, quote unquote, somehow correspond to something down in a park further south down this river, that would be compelling as well. So for Roanoke, this is one of the only secret cities that we've been to since, and the Wright Brothers Monument and that whole area was just super rad. We went in May, kind of before they really started getting a lot of tourists, so it was pretty cool just to wander around and not have to fight the crowds. I've seen in places where people insinuated that the lower left underneath this hanging bell somehow might have looked like one of the trail maps for Fort Raleigh area. I'm not sure if that was this specific region of the painting or if it was something up closer to this dangling person. But following all of those clues in a pretty stepwise manner, I really agree with most that think it's probably in that Fort Raleigh area. And if you were to stand, this is the marker where Franklin Roosevelt was seen in the 30s. And there's another one inside the theater. This photo's from the one outside of the theater. So if you were to stand on that spot and look to the north, that's where the Lost Colony Theater currently sits. So that would get you a specific enough dig spot that would be pretty interesting. We did not and would not try to dig a hole there, although there's enough archaeological crews around that it would be pretty cool if somehow they were digging this area anyway, which obviously has not happened yet. But that just, if you look north at the wing, you're looking at the wing of the theater from that spot. That's my personal favorite. I didn't try to put any holes in the ground anywhere near there because I value my freedom. I personally haven't looked a lot at Charleston myself. I did just mark with that little yellow star where the smush spot would theoretically be. Regarding Charleston, I've always been compelled by the idea that that's sort of the main landmass of Charleston, and that little shape coming up from the eyebrows would point you probably right about where Hampton Park would be. And then Hampton Park means the Citadel, the military school, which obviously might be interesting relative to the word citadel in the verse, in one of the verses, but haven't worked a lot on that one personally. So just for the purposes of being thorough, when you smush St. Augustine and Nola and the corresponding gem from the opposite page, if it were to be buried right below the tail of a horse at a monument, this one of Queen Isabella would be interesting. That Hispanic Park, I think it's called, or Hispanic Garden, I'm sorry, seems like one of the worst ideas for anywhere to try to dig ever. Number one. Number two, I believe that statue has been moved within that garden since its inception, and they do like official ceremonies with the Spanish government and stuff there. So I've never been to St. Augustine personally. I can see why everybody likes the Fountain of Youth, but it's just, if this theory were to hold, I think we'd be looking for the tail of a horse somewhere. As far as NOLA goes, the smush spot puts you just off of 1 o'clock-ish on this clock. No idea what to do with that. Again, haven't spent a whole lot of time on it. Houston, like many, I think that Wheelhouse Solve from the podcast makes a whole lot of sense. The smush spot puts you up near these branches, and I don't know what significance that would or would not have. And then it seems like that cask might be underneath a zoo or a gorilla enclosure, whatever it is now anyway. And for full disclosure purposes, the corresponding smush coming back over to the Montreal painting just puts you in the middle of absolutely nothing. So that's probably the weakest part of this whole theory. It's just there's so much dark space on that painting that, Lord only knows. It just puts you in the middle of nothingness. So if it were possible that it wasn't your direct facing painting that you should smush with, that we could mix and match a little bit, I think the way that we get there comes from New York and San Fran. So one starts the grouping of the paintings in the book, and the other one finishes it. So they're not facing each other, but they would theoretically be matched up because they have the same shape, sort of that rounded off top shape. So what you see here is just some wax paper that I used to outline some key features of the painting. What's unclear to me is if you were to do this, if you should put it on, obviously top to bottom, the rounded edge has to be on the top, but you could put it on one way or flip it to the reverse side. So I've just kind of marked where each of those would land versus their corresponding painting. So I know there's been some movement regarding San Fran recently, that top left photo there. If we were in Golden Gate Park, I believe that puts you pretty close to the Shakespeare Garden, where the other San Fran star would be just outside of the park. Looking at the map, I don't see a lot of green space on the corresponding neighborhood outside of Golden Gate, but I know there's been a lot of other discussion about that. Regarding New York, I forget which park it is, but the folded over part of this gown for the lower left painting might point you towards something relevant, where the other star would put you out in the middle of, I don't know, the Hudson Bay, some body of water. Again, I haven't looked a whole lot at those. It's just sort of rounding off this whole theory. On that note, if you then look at these introductory pages, and they're not sized right where they'd match up, but whatever you'd call this sort of picket at the top of the fence here, it very much to me looks like the picket faces one way and the back the other, and so on. It gets a little bit screwy where the binding of the book is, but if you sort of ignore that part, there's the same number of these little pickets as there are paintings. If we ignore the ones that sort of bleed into where the binding of the book would be. I've always also been very interested about why there's a jewel and this big long nose, and if somehow you connected the nose to its gem on one painting and then made an X with that of the opposite smush partner, but I frankly have never kind of gone that far down that rabbit hole. But this page, or these 2 pages, I should say, just seem like they've had way too much attention, and there was so much detail put into this for it not to matter. I know other people have other theories about what all this stuff could be, but it's just, obviously it's JJP from the initials there, and it just seems like there was too much effort put into it for it to be irrelevant. And from the trickster mindset, it'd be very funny if you had what you think are somewhat direct instructions for how to do this thing right on the first couple pages of the book. So I would think it was funny if it were me, but who knows. And you've hung around this long, just to get this off my chest as well. From the tribute painting, I very much love how these 2 lines in the leash there, one's red and one's blue, and it reminds me a lot of like a Doppler shift, how sounds as something passes you would kind of Doppler shift one way or the other. And that would look a whole lot like the beginning of that loop trail that starts by Daniel Boone, which could indicate that you start one way and then end up sort of back where you began, coming back from around the loop. And right in that area near that old spring, there's the 3 benches, one of which talks about Olivia and one talks about Edwin. And the fact that there's possibly, their names spelled out there, for that proxy or the cask to not be somewhere between those 2 benches is just totally goofy in my brain. But I know there's been a lot of folks saying that it's nowhere near any of those things. But crazy board memes anyway. So thank you for paying attention and for considering this. That's Kiki, my fiance. That's when we visited Cherokee ourselves and stayed in that haunted Sealback hotel last winter between Christmas and New Year's. At the top right is her brother. That's Taylor. He's the guy that solved Blue Sage 7. And we are very much looking forward to 8 as well. I appreciate any thoughts or feedback, and mostly just need to get this out of my brain because it's been driving me crazy for several months. So thank you very much.